Did you have any experiences personally with psychedelics before you wrote this book?
Very limited. I started the research in 2014. I wrote a piece for The New Yorker called The Trip Treatment, which is online, and it was my first foray into this work. I went down to Hopkins and spent a lot of time at NYU, and at the time they were doing this really interesting trial where they were giving psilocybin to people with cancer diagnoses. Many of whom were terminal. And that seemed like such a weird idea to me that I was curious to explore it. And I spent a lot of time talking to patients, many of whom were dying, about how this single high-dose psilocybin experience, a guided psilocybin experience, completely reset these people's attitude toward death.
To die, to expire, to pass on, to perish. Dead as a doornail, dead as a herring, dead as a mutton. God's way of saying, slow down.
To check out.
To shuffle off this mortal coil.
To head for the happy hunting ground.
To blink for an exceptionally long period of time.
And allowed them to die with equanimity. And when these results were published, they found that in 80% of the people who had the session, they had statistically significant reductions in standard measures of depression and anxiety. It was one of the most effective psychiatric interventions that these psychiatrists had ever seen.
The most glorious part was that it made me feel more comfortable with living because you're not afraid of dying.
A single experience. A molecule could change the contents of your head to the extent that you would rethink your mortality. So I'd never had a big trip. I didn't feel psychologically sturdy enough, and I came of age just when the scare stories about psychedelics were everywhere in the culture.
This is LSD. Psilocybin.
I know too many kids around here that they tell me that they've been on bad trips on LSD. They saw rats, roaches in different sizes, shapes, and colors. It was like a nightmare. That stuff ain't for me. No way.
This much LSD would kill 20 people. The lethal dose is 15,000 micrograms. Now that's 1/1,000,000th of an ounce. That's about what a particle of dust weighs.
You know, they would scramble your chromosomes, you'd stare at the sun till you went blind. You know, these stories were out there. And I was afraid to. I was just afraid.
The only time I think I've ever been able to understand myself was on an acid trip. Then things were really clear.
As a psychologist, I have to tell you that the understanding you think you have gained just doesn't fit in with the facts.
So discovering this kind of later in life, certainly not something I planned on or expected.
When you were researching this book, did you start doing your own personal experimentation?
Yeah, I had a series of trips for the book for a couple reasons. I'd become very curious about the people I was interviewing, trying to make sense of how they could have these transformative trips on a drug, which seemed implausible to me.
It's not so much outside you see everything, it's when you close your eyes you see stuff.
I'm feeling very happy. I never feel so happy ever in my life.
That's it, that's where your inner world is different. It's like those paintings.
I also kind of got jealous of the experiences they were having. They were having these big spiritual experiences, and I swear, I don't think I've ever had a spiritual experience. I'm kind of spiritually retarded, actually, or was.
What seems to be the reason that we exist? Like, when we feel good about ourselves, when we are inspired and motivated, we're in love. That's what love is. So that seems to be the only reason we're here.
I realized at a certain point I had to see the experience from inside to describe it in a book. It's also kind of my brand as a writer. When I wrote about the cattle industry, I bought a steer When I wrote about architecture, I built a house. I like to get my hands dirty and see things from inside. There's a quality of wonder you can capture doing something for the first time. So in a way, the fact I was psychedelically naive, I saw as a positive. Because people who really know the territory are not going to have quite the same first experience that I was going to have. So that was really helpful. I went mushroom hunting with Paul Stamets.
My mission is to discover the language of nature of the fungal networks that communicate with the ecosystem. And I, in particular, believe nature is intelligent.
He's a very cool guy.
He's crazy.
He's totally crazy. And he took me to a spot where you can find the strongest psilocybin known to man. We spent a couple days outside looking for these mushrooms, and we found Psilocybin azurescens, which he found for the first time and named after his son, Azurius. And I was very excited when we found a couple. I was a little reluctant to take them, but I did. I had my first psilocybin experience since my 20s, and at the time I was like 60 or approaching 60. I made a tea, and I had a really powerful experience. I was at our house. We have a house in New England that we've had for many years, and I was in my garden. It was very much about being in nature. You know, I've written a lot about plants, and I've written about plant intelligence and plant consciousness and things like that, and I've always believed intellectually that plants, domesticated plants, are acting on us. It's a two-way street. We change plants, they change us. In the same way that, say, the flower is manipulating the bee, making it come pay attention to it, offering it nectar in exchange for it picking up pollen on its legs, and doesn't even realize what it's really doing is being tricked by the plant into pollinating it and carrying its genes down the street or around the world. That's happening to us too, and plants work on us. It's a slightly trippy idea, but it's just coevolution. That's how coevolution works. So during this experience, I felt that in a way I never had. That idea became flesh. I felt that these plants were kind of looking back at me, and that there were more subjectivities in my garden than I thought. You know, we go through the world thinking we're the only thinking subject. Yes. Everything else is an object. One of the things that happens on psychedelics is everything has life in it, has consciousness in it. And that was a powerful and beautiful experience.
Now, as an intelligent, rational person, did you start pondering whether or not you were just perceiving this because it was convenient and you were hallucinating?
You know, I'm sure I was projecting things onto them, but I've looked at this question and the science of it pretty closely.
Right.
And how you define consciousness matters here, but plants are conscious in the sense of they're aware of their environment. They have senses. They're not like our senses, but they're picking up on chemicals in the air and in the soil and light in very specific ways, and they're reacting, not just instinctually, but appropriately. There are experiments that show that plants can learn in some primitive way. So we have to understand that we have one kind of consciousness, and other animals and even plants have another kind of consciousness. So it's real. It's a real thing. The idea that they're looking back at me, I'm being metaphorical, but that they're aware of me in the way that the plant is aware that the bee is nearby and does certain things, sometimes to trap the bee and hold it there for a longer amount of time to load it up with pollen. The world as we perceive it is dependent on the particular senses we have. We've got the big five senses that you always hear about. But other creatures have a different set of senses, and therefore they live in a different world. So we have to realize that this is a very specific world that we're perceiving in our normal consciousness that is good for us, that we're designed for it, reflecting our bodies and our upright stance, everything about us. But other creatures are seeing a different world. And one of the interesting things about psychedelics is you get some insight into that. You sort of feel it. So this idea that there's something relative about our everyday normal consciousness, that there are other ways to experience the world, is something that psychedelics put you in touch with.
Have you guys ever listened to a podcast and thought, man, this story would make a great documentary film? Well, that's exactly what inspired this channel. I'm Jeremy, and I'm all about exploring interesting ideas and fascinating people through short documentary-style films. If you want to see this channel grow, please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you really want to see this thing take off, support me on Patreon so I can quit my job and do this full-time. Thanks, guys. See you next week.